English, Unit 2, Chapter 2, Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan. This is the story of Helen Keller, who lost her hearing and vision at the age of 3. She went on to graduate from Radcliffe and thus create history. Anne Sullivan was her teacher who played a major part in Helen Keller's growth and learning. This chapter gives us a glimpse of the early days when Anne Sullivan had just met Helen Keller and their learning had recently begun. It was the 3rd of March on 1887, 3 months before Helen Keller became 7 years old, that Anne Sullivan entered her life. Before her education began, Helen Keller describes herself as a ship who has been caught in a dense fog in the sea and is searching for the white darkness. Light, give me light was the wordless cry that Helen Keller had in her soul. Anne Sullivan taught her to read, write, using a lot of patience and different techniques. When Anne Sullivan first came, she gave Helen Keller a doll. And while Helen was playing with the doll, she wrote on the other hand of Helen the letters D-O-L-L. Helen tried repeatedly to imitate the letters that Mrs. Sullivan had just drawn on her hand. When she was successful, she felt a flush of pride and ran downstairs to show her mother what she had learnt. It took several weeks for Helen to understand that every object had a name assigned to it. There were many days when she simply could not understand what a word meant, and Mrs. Sullivan had to use a different technique to explain to her. We will look at one such incident. One day, while I was playing with my new doll, Mrs. Sullivan put my big rag doll into my lap also, spelled D-O-L-L, and tried to make me understand that D-O-L-L applied to both. Earlier in the day, we had a tussle over the words M-U-G and W-A-T-E-R. Miss Sullivan had tried to impress it upon me that M-U-G is mug and that W-A-T-E-R is water. But I persisted in confounding the two. In despair, she had dropped the subject for the time, only to renew it at the first opportunity. I became impatient at her repeated attempts, and seizing the new doll, I dashed it upon the floor. I was keenly delighted when I felt the fragments of the broken doll at my feet. Neither sorrow nor regret followed my passionate outburst. I had not loved the doll. In the still, dark world in which I lived, there was no strong sentiment or tenderness. I felt my teacher sweep the fragments to one side of the hearth, and I had a sense of satisfaction that the cause of my discomfort was removed. So, she brought me my hat, and I knew I was going out into the warm sunshine. This thought, if a wordless sensation may be called a thought, made me hop and skip with pleasure. We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over my one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness, as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing through over my hand. That living word awakened my soul and gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. There were barriers still, it is true, but barriers that could in time be swept away. I left the well house eager to learn. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object that I touched seemed to quiver with life. That was because I saw something with a strange new sight that had come to me. On entering the door, I remembered the doll I had broken. I felt my way to the hearth and picked up the pieces. I tried vainly to pull them together. Then my eyes filled with tears, for I realized what I had done, and for the first time I felt repentance and sorrow. I learned a great many new words that day. I do not remember what they all were, but I do know that mother, father, sister, teacher were among them. Words that would to make the world blossom for me, like Aaron's rod with flower. It would have been difficult to find a happier child than I was as I lay in my crib at the close of that eventful day and lived over the joys it had brought to me, and for the first time longed for a new day to come. Helen went on to become a graduate cum laude from Radcliffe. She then devoted the rest of her life to teaching and giving hope to the blind and deaf, as her teacher had done. She and Anne remained friends until Anne's death. This particular incident that we just listened to is said to be the incident that changed Helen's whole view towards learning. She gained new confidence and looked at the world in a new way. Let us look at some exercises now. See whether the following sentences are true or false. A. The most important day in Helen Keller's life was when her teacher came to her. True. B. When young Helen stretched out her hand, her mother took it. False. Her teacher took it. C. Young Helen learned to spell many words without understanding them. True. D. One day young Helen understood that everything has a name. True. E. Young Helen did not try to put the pieces of the doll together. False. She did try. F. Young Helen felt sorry that she had broken the doll. False. When she broke the doll, young Helen did not feel anything towards it. Read the following sentences and frame at least 2 relevant questions on each. A. I was like that ship before my education began. Who was like that ship before her education began? Who was like what before her education began? B. One day I was playing with the new doll. One day I was playing with what? When was I playing with my new doll? C. I learned a great many new words that day. What did I learn that day? I learned a great many words when. D. She bought my hat. Who bought my hat? What did she buy for me? E. We walked down the path to the well house. Where did we walk down? Who walked down the path to the well house? F. The living word awakened my soul. What awakened my soul? What did the living word awaken in me? End of chapter 2, unit 2. This is the continuation of unit 2, chapter 2. We'll be going through the chapter once again and looking at some more questions along with it. Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan. It starts with a quote. Knowledge is love and light and vision. This quote is by Helen Keller herself. A bit of background. Helen Keller became ill at the age of 2 and was left blind and deaf. For the next 5 years, she grew up in a world of darkness and emptiness. She was afraid, alone, and without any anchor. This is the story of her meeting the teacher who would change her life. The most important day I remember in all of my life is the one on which my teacher, Anne Mansfield Sullivan, came to me. I am filled with wonder when I consider the immeasurable contrasts between the two lives which in it which it connects. It was the 3rd of March 1887, 3 months before I was 7 years old. On the afternoon of that eventful day, I stood on the porch, dumb and expectant. I guessed vaguely from my mother's signs and from the hurrying to and fro in the house that something unusual was about to happen. So I went to the door and waited on the steps. The afternoon sun penetrated the mass of honeysuckle that covered the porch and fell on my upturned face. My fingers lingered almost unconsciously on the familiar leaves and blossoms which had just come forth to greet the sweet southern spring. I did not know what the future held of marvel or surprise for me. Anger and bitterness had preyed upon me continually for weeks, and a deep languor had succeeded this passionate struggle. Have you ever been at sea in a dense fog, when it seemed as if a tangible white darkness shut you in, and the great ship, tense and anxious, groped her way towards the shore with plummet and sounding line, and you waited with beating heart for something to happen? I was like that ship before my education began. The question with it is, the author refers to two contrasting emotions. What are they? The contrasting emotions described in the passage are: on one side, it is said, as there is a darkness and emptiness without the education, a certain anger and bitterness. But the author says that after Anne Sullivan came to her life, she was filled with wonder. Those are the contrasts. The second question is, what does the author compare herself to? The author compares herself to a ship in a sea with a dense fog, which has a tangible white darkness where you cannot move or know where what is going on. Moving on, I was like that ship before my education began, only I was without compass or sounding line, and had no way of knowing how near the harbour was. Light, give me light, was the wordless cry of my soul, and the light of love shone on me in that very hour. I felt approaching footsteps. I stretched out my hand and supposed it was my mother. Someone took it, and I was caught up and held close in the arms of her who had come to reveal all things to me, and more than all things else, to love me. The morning after my teacher came, she led me into her room and gave me a doll. The little blind children at Perkins Institution had sent it, and Laura Bridgman had dressed it, but I did not know this until afterward. When I played with it a little while, Miss Sullivan slowly spelled into my hand the word doll, D-O-L-L. I was at once interested in this finger play and tried to imitate it. When I finally succeeded in making the letters correctly, I was flushed with childish pleasure and pride. Running downstairs to my mother, I held up my hand and made the letters for doll. I did not know what I was spelling, a word, or even that words existed. I was simply making my fingers go in monkey-like imitation. In the days